powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems.
चुन चुन करके हिसाब लेना ये मेरी फितरत है.
Why should it be a problem if I'm smart enough to have multiple options? You should be admiring me.
भारत झुकने वाला भी नहीं.
The rise of India will be determined by India. It will be determined by our strength, not by the mistakes of others.
The old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Now in this video we are going to talk about what happens if India cannot control its trade deficit. And this is a burning question. Actually, it's a very important question, yet it looks like a very simple one, but it's a very important question. Why? Because here's what actually happens when a country loses control of its trade deficit. It shrinks strategically. The foreign policy room gets tighter. Okay. For example, look at Pakistan or any other African country, right? Then you have the industrial ambitions, they get compressed. The dependencies, they get deeper, and it happens very quietly year after year while GDP is still growing and the headlines all look good and all that. But it keeps happening, right? It happens, right? Like I said, your economy, it shrinks, it continues to shrink. Look at purchasing power parity terms. US economy, the economic activity right now has shrunk so much so that it is 50% of India's total economic activity. India's economic activity is like 17% of the global economic activity. US economic activity is 9%. China's economic activity is around 25% or so. Okay, so that's what we are going to talk about today. I will explain you what exactly happens if India cannot control its trade deficit, right? So let's get going. Let's get started. Please do like and subscribe. Okay, and there you go. Okay, so let's start with the baseline. What are we actually dealing with? Let me share my slide real quick, okay? So what we're dealing with here is the goods trade deficit, import minus exports of physical stuff, right? So which is around $270 billion. Okay? Then you can go back and in the video and go back and look at the slide too if you want to, all right? Now, service surplus is $163 billion, then $125 billion is remittances. Then if you look into it, then you find that its crude oil import is $130 billion. Now, if you look into the country concentration right here, so what do you see? You see that India's trade deficit from Russia alone is $64 billion. And then it is $101 billion from China. Now, you have to understand this, that most of these Indian traders, they prefer to import things from China. You have to understand it. It's because it is cheaper for them. Okay. And the total trade deficit is $165 billion. Okay, and that is the 61% of total deficit. All right, and these are just two countries that contribute to that 61% of the total trade deficit. Okay, and if you look into the current account deficit part of it, current account deficit, which is the real financing gap after you net everything out, okay, which is around 1.5 to 2% of GDP in normal years. All right, you can see this thing at the bottom in the red. Okay, and a demand for oil price shocks pushes it to 3%. So when you look into the current account deficit, and if it reaches 3% or above, then you have to start looking into things that, okay, what is going on. 1.5 to 2% is mainly it's manageable. Okay, it's not great, and it's not catastrophic either, but manageable. Okay, now here's the interesting thing that you have to understand about this structural problem. Okay, what you have to understand is that most of the trade deficit comes from the crude oil. India's annual oil import bill is around $130 billion. Okay, and that's nearly what half the entire goods deficit. So just one commodity, the oil, right? So, and oil is something that it's non-negotiable. India runs on diesel, the trucks, the tractors, the factories, just name it, everything pretty much, right? And you can't just cut that import without shutting down the economy. You cannot go and say that, all right, we're not going to use oil anymore. Only thing you can say is that, hey, let's cut the domestic usage of it, as in that petrol part of it. But still, diesel is still very, very important. So you cannot fix this by raising the interest rate or making some policy changes by RBI and all that, right? And cutting government spending and all that. You cannot change that. Those tools don't what do you call it? They address the root cause. So what exactly need to be done is to change what India produces domestically and change what it depends on from abroad. And that takes decades, if not quarters. Okay. So here's what India is doing, though. I will tell you. This is a very good mechanics here. Okay. The way things are going right now globally. Hmm? So, and I made a whole video on this thing. In fact, just by my last two, three, I don't even remember the titles of my videos, but I did make videos about what I'm going to explain right now. It's very simple. India's trade, India imports $130 billion worth of oil. Okay. Now, Russia gives it cheaper to India, like $55 billion, and still Russians don't meet the entire demand. Okay, which is 5.5 million barrels per day. That's India's total crude demand. Now, once UAE, once UAE, Emirates, once they increase their capacity, the production capacity to 5 million barrels per day, then India is going to simply import the whole entire UAE's oil. Okay. And to meet the domestic demands. And what India is going to do after that is the 2.5 to 3 million barrels that India imports from Russia. What India is going to do that is India is going to sell that at a higher price. So India will import it for 55 million barrels, sorry, $55 per barrel, and sell it for $75 to $80 per barrel. That is the standard pricing for refined crude products. So if India sells higher and buys lower, then you look into it, then you find that the Russians are already benefited by it. Why? Because Russian break-even pricing is very small. Okay. And India sells it higher. So what India is doing is that India actually is minimizing that $130 billion import cost by selling the refined crude products. So if India sells, say, refined crude product, $150 billion worth of refined crude products, after meeting the domestic demand from UAE, then what's going to happen is that it's not going to be $130 billion. It's going to come down to probably, say, net will be $80 to $90 billion of crude oil import, the overall cost. That's the mechanism that India is doing. And if few other countries join this game, why? Because the crude prices are going up and up. Okay, crude prices are only going to go up. So nobody's going to buy the crude oil as such. If India is selling countries cheaper refined crude product, then why would anyone buy the crude to refine it further? Right? That's the mechanism that India is applying in order to tackle this structural gap. All right. And that's what it is. Now let's talk about the actual problems that we are going to address in this video, about the question that was there, right? That what exactly will happen if India cannot control the trade deficit. So let's talk about all that. All right, so after we have established the structural gap, let's talk about what exactly will happen when these structural gaps actually widen and problem becomes more severe. That is, trade deficit is it's uncontrollable. Okay, so let's look into it. First of all, let me share my slide here. See, if India cannot control its trade deficit, the first damage is rupee pressure. What will happen? See, India imports large quantities of energy, electronics, machinery, and critical inputs. Okay, so when India does that, so importing itself is not a problem. Okay, but when you keep importing it, then what you're doing is that you are constantly losing that money. Why? Because you had to print the money or get the FDI or FPI or some sort of external mechanism to pump the money into your market to make up for that gap that was created by the trade deficit. Okay, now you have to understand one thing though. First of all, that the whole currency purchase happens at the forex market, just like stock trading. Okay, so what happens over there is that, you know how things work in stock. You buy low and sell high, right? You buy a stock at a cheaper price and then you sell it at a higher price. When the stock prices go up, then you sell it, and that's how you make the money, right? Same thing, exact same principle applies to the currency market as well, where let's say traders buy rupee at 60 rupees, 60, $1 is 60. Okay, at that exchange rate they buy that. Okay, and then as soon as rupee depreciates, then what they do is that they immediately start selling that off. That creates a surplus of rupee. Okay, which means that rupee is depreciating, right? And so when that happens, then after a point, these traders, they stop taking that money. And when they stop taking money, then what happens? Then you bleed more money actually. And so this is how, in nutshell, in a very crude way, I would say the forex market actually works. Now let's suppose that India imports $800 billion worth of stuff but exports just $600 billion, right? So there is a $200 billion gap. Now, this gap has to come from somewhere else, right? Like I said, foreign investments, service exports, remittances, foreign reserves, whatever, right? Borrowing, whatever you do. And if these cannot keep up, then pressure lands on rupee. And why is that? You always have to print it, right? And that printing basically creates excess money. Printing, or say when traders start to sell the money, then you are basically losing that money into the market. Money actually becomes surplus, so it value supply and demand, right? So demand is less, supply is more, then value automatically goes down, meaning that currency is weak. And this is the same thing happens with the dollar too. What's happening with the dollar? See, what's happening with the dollar is that because of loss of trade deficit, at first in the beginning of time, the trade deficit was actually managed by the treasury securities, Federal Reserve securities, then other securities and bonds that US was selling to outside other countries. So what other countries were doing is that they were buying all that. So that's how money was getting pumped back into the US market, and that's how they were managing that trade deficit. Okay, like I explained earlier. But what's happening now is that countries are not buying back all that. They're not investing into treasury markets or other securities. Okay, so that's what's creating problem, and that's why Donald Trump is basically trying to cut that trade deficit. Why? Because he's not getting that ROI. Okay, now what US was doing before is that they were, so if when the investment wasn't enough, all right, when the investment into treasury and security and all these things was not enough to make up for the trade deficit gap, because US just imported, that's why they did, because that's how you keep the dollar into the demand, okay, in the need for dollar. So to manage for that gap, they needed, so slowly in the beginning gap was managed by the investment, but later on that gap started to widen, and the back investment couldn't do it. So what US had to do for the remaining one, they had to print the dollar. So that's why when you print the dollar, then it goes into your national debt. Why? Because for example, let's say you are somebody, you have, your income is 5 rupees and your expenses are 10 rupees. So what do? You go and ask for your neighbor. You say that, hey man, can I borrow 5 rupees from you? They say that, for what? Oh, we have this 10 rupees our bill, so we just want to borrow 5 so that we can pay off the rest of the bill. And you did that. But what exactly that 5 rupee is? When you're borrowing or asking for all that from external sources or somewhere, or even if you're printing it, that is ultimately a debt, right? Loan, debt, whatever you want to call it, different wordings for the same thing. And that's exactly what happens, and that's how currency weakens over the period of time. Okay, and this principle applies to everything, whether it is dollar, whether it is rupee, doesn't matter what currency it is. Okay, so there it is. Now, because your currency has weakened, okay, because your currency has weakened, so it has another impact. So let me share my slide again. So when your currency is weakened, a weaker rupee makes what? Oil, gas, fertilizer, electronics, machinery, everything costlier. Whatever you are importing, it's gonna become costly. Why? Because in the international forex market, what happened? The moment rupee became weak from 60 to 83, people started to sell it, right? So they got rid of it. Now things are becoming more and more expensive because you don't have a way to make up for the loss, right? So now when it is weak, then what you're gonna do? Whenever you import, you are putting more dollar outside. You are paying more dollars. If when are you going to pay more dollar? When $1 is 60, or when $1 is 80 rupee? You are going to pay more dollar when $1 is 80 rupee, right? Meaning that when currency depreciates. So that's why your imports become expensive, meaning that whenever you are going to import the crude oil, okay, whenever you are even going to import the crude oil, which is the more largest import, even that's gonna become more and more expensive because your currency is depreciating, right? So you see the vicious loop here, right? So this vicious loop is what government is trying to avoid, where you are importing, the currency becomes weak because your first thing, your goods export is not that much, and second thing is your imports are growing up. Okay, they are just simply growing. Now when they're growing, uh, it will eventually lead to this problem, right? So that's another thing that happens when the trade deficit is out of control. Now how government can actually fix these things? This gets fixed by bringing in more FDI, by increasing the foreign portfolio indexes and all that, meaning the government has to come up with a way for people to either do the portfolio investment or bring in the direct investment, to do the foreign direct investment or foreign portfolio investment, or simply directly borrowing. Okay, in any case, you have to bring in more money to make up for that deficit one way or the other. And this is why, if you notice, Prime Minister Modi is on 5 country tour. Okay, I'm just explaining you the fundamentals that are happening, and whatever the government is doing, and how those two correlate. Okay, so Prime Minister Modi is traveling or on a tour of 5 nations because he wants all that, the like semiconductors, then defense, then energy and all that, to be there in India ASAP, so that as soon as possible, that is, okay, so that manufacturing, semiconductors, all the get going, you get going into it, because this is the fourth industrial revolution. We are entering the fourth industrial revolution. So this is a race against time. It's not something that you can just sit there and wait. Longer you wait, bigger the problem. Okay, number one thing. Second thing is that if you don't do anything, then somebody else will do it. This is why I said that it's a race against time. So whomever does the first takes the lead and has the advantage. Okay, so if you want to beat China, then you have to take that step. So this is why he's going to Europe tour, so that India's free trade agreement with Europe. Europe is almost $20 trillion market. Okay, so that free trade agreement can be utilized as soon as possible. So when that happens, what's going to happen is that the trade deficit is going to decrease. All right, so this is how these things work. So what government does is what government does, whatever is happening around us. So I just try to explain these things through the fundamental economic principles. Okay, so you have to always understand, geopolitics doesn't work in isolation. It's geopolitics for the most part is a geoeconomics, I would say. It can be reactive, and then there is proactive implications too. But if you don't know ahead of time, or don't have the backup plan ahead of time, then geoeconomics can actually come back and bite you. Okay, so it can be proactive and it can be reactive, both things, but you have to be prepared for both of them. It doesn't work in isolation for sure. Okay, so there that is. Now let's talk about the another impact. Now, next thing that actually is impacted is the foreign reserve. Foreign reserves, they face pressure. Now, let's look at the slide right here. Okay. So, foreign reserves, they get used defensively because there is too much pressure. Like I explained earlier, that as soon as currency depreciates, people sell it. So, who actually pays that money to those traders? The government of India pays that money. Like, let's say the moment, say, rupee goes 80 90 rupees per dollar, then when the traders start to sell it, then who actually you think pays that money? Government of India pays. That's what's called buying the rupee back, and to release the pressure, meaning that you pay $65 billion or whatever the money is at that point. The amount, the remaining, it depends on the volume. So depending on the rupee volume that was sold, liquidation volume. Okay, so based on that, government of India pays that much money to make up for all that. Okay, so there are things that are involved here. So this is why it puts pressure on the foreign exchange reserve. Why? Because you have to pay in something that is acceptable, right? And when it puts pressure on the forex reserve, you start to deplete your forex reserve too. Yeah, you may have $700 billion of forex reserve. So India may be in a I would say decent position to handle this problem for a little bit longer time, but it's not untouched. If exports don't grow, then and import this the trade deficit becomes wider and wider and wider. Simply because your energy prices are going up, simply because of supply chain disruption, all the other odd reasons, then you have a problem, right? And how do you counter all that? So each and every problem is countered differently. Like, for example, energy problem. India's energy problem is being countered by UAE. It's not going to happen this year. It's going to happen next year when Fajura pipeline is ready. Then India can easily bypass the whole entire Strait of Hormuz and all that. After that, if somebody attacks, then Indian Navy is well capable of tackling the problem. Okay. So, but that's gonna be functional in 2027, right? So until then, India has to somehow manage things. India has to come up with alternatives to handle these things, and shorter supply chain is the best thing for India. Okay, that's why they are India is always India is more betting on UAE. Why? Because that's the shortest supply chain, and if UAE increases its oil production from 5 million barrels up to 5 million barrels or 5.5 million barrels, that will meet India's domestic demand for natural gas, for everything else, along with the petrol and all that, right? And then rest of the energy that India will purchase from Russia, India can just simply sell it into the international market as per the standard oil pricing. And actually, India can make more profit because of higher energy prices down the line. Okay. So, so that's how India will manage all these things. But for now, at least for a year, this is going to be a tad bit of problem. All right. And India's export is going to grow too. By the end of this year, I suppose that India's export is going to be probably $1 trillion. But still, there is a trade deficit. It has to be fixed in different. So, and it will be fixed from different sectors: semiconductor, defense, then services. Now you notice that why India had opened lots of IITs, why India opened lots of AI aims, medical colleges, and all that, because that's the service sector. Setting up a manufacturing, hard building and all the infrastructure takes time, but setting up services doesn't take too long. So you have more and more young population, you send them to these colleges and they are ready to go provide services somewhere else. Hmm? And that's how you increase. That's why India has $165 billion of services surplus. So when you have something excess or surplus somewhere, that's what you work on, right? This is why India is working with Russia, this is why India is working with Germany, this is why India is working with Europe, Israel, everybody else, to increase the service sector. And in fact, lots of Indian population that is in UAE, it's even going to grow further over the period of time. Okay, so that's how the Indian government is trying to narrow down that trade deficit so that it stays in control. Okay. Now the last thing that is very important, something that is the cornerstone, or I would say that's the foundation of India's foreign policy, and that is its strategic autonomy. Okay, so when your currency becomes weaker, you don't have the foreign X that much. You have to deal with different other problems. Then strategic autonomy becomes more and more expensive. Look at Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't have any strategic autonomy. They do what America tells them to do. They do what Chinese tell them to do. They cannot go and say no. Why? Because they're begging for chump changes from IMF. Right? India can still buy from Russia, the Gulf, Africa, and others, but a weak currency means every foreign policy option costs more. Right? Simple reason being that uh, you are bleeding more and more forex, and forex meaning dollar meaning that you are dependent on somebody else to gain that dollar. If your rupee is weaker, why do you think that UAE is going to agree to trade in the national currency? If rupee is weaker, then why do you think Russians will agree to trade in the national currencies? These are certain nuances you have to think about, right? So, I mean, behind the scenes, Russians actually. There have been times when the Russians simply said that, oh, we cannot take further rupee because we don't know what to do with it. So then India said that, hey, come invest in our markets. Invest where? FDIs, portfolios, borrowing, treasury, security, all that mumbo jumbo, right? The things that I talked about earlier that will actually make up for the trade deficit. And that's exactly what India asked Russia to do, the same thing that America asked other countries to do. That, yeah, we will import from you, but why don't you just come and invest in our markets? So when Russians saw that, oh, India's market is pretty huge, so that's when they were like, yeah, we can do that. Because they started to see the quick return of investment. All right. And that's what it is. So if your currency weakens, that's the worst part, the strategic autonomy. You're going to lose your strategic autonomy. Okay. And then next thing is, let me show you another thing actually real quick, is the manufacturing weakness gets exposed. Okay. So when the real danger, basically, it's not the deficit stuff. The danger is importing too many finished goods while exporting too few high value manufactured products, right? And so your manufacturing weakness, meaning that you cannot manufacture things. So, like for example, I'll give you a simple example: manufacturing or producing whatever. Let's say you have iron ore. You export iron ore and import steel. How is that even the smart move? Hmm? Or for lots of countries, if you are a crude producing country and then you are importing the refined oil by exporting the crude, what good is that? So why don't you just simply set up your own refinery? Right? And this is why I was saying earlier that the whole mechanism, the crude oil market, actually is going to be busted pretty soon. And because of the high crude prices, countries are not going to export crude because nobody is going to buy it. But if India continues to sell cheaper refined crude product, then countries are going to import that. Hmm? So it's all about the production. How do you produce things? So, for example, import finished good, right? Oil, petroleum, electronics, consumer goods, machinery, equipment, gold, chemical, pharmaceuticals. So, what India needs to export more of? High value manufactured goods, semiconductors and electronics, defense equipment, specifically specialty chemicals, electric vehicles, clean energy hardware. So, things that I already talked about, right? These are the things that India needs to export. And yeah, you can import chips and all, but again, Prime Minister Modi just went to do the deal with the ASML in Netherlands. He went to do that deal so that the chip fabs can be established in India, so India doesn't have to import all that. Think about it. So this is how you actually set up the complete ecosystem. When you set up the end-to-end ecosystem in your environment, then that's how you minimize the trade deficit over and over, because India realizes that there are certain things India cannot minimize. That is oil, energy things, right? So they have to do it this way. All right. So, but so all in all, if you ask me, see, trade deficit in itself does not destroy the economy, it does not destroy the country or something, but when the currency weakens, then it becomes a bigger problem. Okay. So uncontrolled trade deficit will become what, the things that I have said earlier, that it turns into energy dependence, then rupee weakness, inflation will have impact on the local politics, then domestic politics and all that. Then it will have problems with the further manufacturing, which is irreversible practically. Why? Because nobody will invest in your market. Lots of things happens. The cumulative effect is what? You become Pakistan. Okay, in nutshell, in one word, if I have to describe the whole thing, you become Pakistan. That's all it is. Okay. So this is it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and please do like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys in another video. Take care.